Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Devils, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1. And this game started off pretty well for the Sharks. It seemed as though for the first half of this game, so the first 30 or so minutes, the Sharks were the better team. The Devils kind of looked out of sorts, you could say, and the Sharks look to be, while not dominating, as I've said sometimes this season, they seem to be in control, and they would have the only goal in this first half of the game, and that would come from Tim Heed, his first of the year, in the first 7 or so minutes of the first period. But the Sharks would not be able to build on that lead, and this lack of offense now, with all these injuries beginning to catch up with them. Suomela was another one who didn't end up playing here tonight due to his injuries sustained, at least that's how it seems, in the previous game. However, once the halfway point in this game came, the Devils started to come back. They had multiple power plays, including a 5-on-3, and eventually Bratt would score on a breakaway. That would be at even strength in the last few minutes of the second period, and the game would be tied at 1. We'd come to the third, more power plays for the Devils. I believe they ended up with 6 tonight. Subban would finally get one for them, and that would put them 2-1, and the Sharks just not really doing much offensively, enough to get past Blackwood, who had a pretty solid game for the Devils, and the Sharks would lose it 2-1 to one of the few teams who are below them in the standings. And the first thing to talk about would be, of course, Martin Jones, as he ends up getting the start here tonight. He had a pretty solid game, certainly. He had very little chance on this Bratt goal. Very, very nice move by him, and he made a couple of very nice saves. The Subban one, on the other hand, is certainly one you could argue. It seemed as though Jones was tracking it well, but then at the last moment looked in the other direction, basically right as Subban shot, so Jones did not end up seeing this puck. So a small misplay from him, but he led in 2 goals tonight. He made a couple of huge saves, one off of a deflection in the first period, a massive one on the 5-on-3 that I talked about earlier. And so it was a good game from Jones, certainly building on that Minnesota Wild game earlier. And while that game, the Sharks only scoring a single goal was enough to get the victory, here tonight, the single goal was not enough. And I guess that goes to show that scoring 1 goal a game is probably not going to get you too many wins. Next to talk about would be Simek, as he got to jump into a larger role here because of Brendan Dillon getting traded to the Washington Capitals. Simek returned back to that top pairing with Brent Burns. This was a pairing that existed earlier on this season when Simek returned from that knee injury, but because Simek was pretty inconsistent at the start, he ended up getting demoted to the third pairing, and Dillon was pushed up to the first pairing with Burns. But as I said, Simek now returning to this spot, and he was quite solid in this game. A couple of good offensive chances, jumping into the play pretty aggressively at times, but also was quite solid defensively. Him and his partner Brent Burns, who I also thought had a solid game, played this one rather well. Again, just in the end, it wasn't really enough, not because of the defensive side, but more so because of the offensive side. Next, I'll talk about these special teams, as of course it did get to play a huge role tonight. As I said, the Sharks ended up shorthanded 6 times tonight, and they ended up going 5 for 6 on the penalty kill. Certainly not a bad percentage, but it's been somewhat of a trend here in these past dozen or so games where the Sharks just almost every single game are letting up a power play goal, and they've actually managed to remain at the top of the list in terms of penalty kill percentages through these times, but it really hasn't been as solid as it once was, a month ago, you could certainly say. And so I'm hoping that the penalty kill can shore itself up a bit. Of course, it is suffering with the fact that Couture is gone, that Hertl is out, that now Dillon, I guess you could also say, is out. Carlson was still a decent part of the penalty kill as well, and he's out injured. So it's tough to keep up the penalty kill with a lot of these moving pieces, and you have some of these more unfamiliar players doing these roles, like Shellman, who probably wouldn't find himself playing on the penalty kill if you had Couture and Hertl healthy, but still, you'd like to see it maybe pick up a bit. The power play, on the other hand, also not really doing too much for the Sharks, but this is even harder to blame with all of the injuries that the Sharks do have. I mean, you take a look at the first power play unit, and I guess if Burns gets the first call, there's 2 of the 5 players on the ice who would find themselves normally on the first power play unit on a fully healthy Sharks team, because there's no Couture, there's no Hertl, and there's no Erik Karlsson. So it's kind of hard to put too much blame on the power play as of late. I mean, just taking a look at that 5-on-3, it was the 5-on-3 not tonight, but a couple games back against the Minnesota Wild. It was just completely powerless. They were super out of sync, and you do have to put some blame on the fact that the Sharks do have the injuries, but again, those are certainly excuses, but you do want to see the power play still being able to chip in here or there, and it really hasn't been doing all that much for the Sharks. We'll see if it does improve with the return of Evander Kane for the next game, as this was his last game serving suspension. And finally, I'll talk about this new pairing that we've had with Middleton and Heed. Both of these players recently having jumped into the lineup. Heed came in once Karlsson went down for the season, and Middleton has come in now that Dylan has been traded. And this pairing was a bit up and down. They had somewhat poor coverage, although it was due to a bad change, so I wouldn't necessarily blame Middleton in this scenario on this Bratt goal. He'd had some pretty nice offensive looks, but the defensive side was still somewhat shaky. Middleton wasn't as awful as he has been in the past, but there is certainly room for improvement. And with, as I said, Karlsson out for so long, Dylan is gone now for good, these two will likely find themselves in the Sharks lineup more so every single game, unless the Sharks want to give, let's say, a ninth defenseman a try in Middleton's position. But we'll see how they do. It was a decent start here tonight against a not-so-great team. Once they face off against tougher competition, coming up against the Rangers, who are in the playoff race, we'll see how they perform. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday. As I said, they will be facing off against the Rangers, a team who the Sharks' first game against them didn't go particularly well. They actually had a 3-2 lead early in the third period, but then ended up completely blowing it. A pretty bad game from Martin Jones. I believe Arundel will be in nets for that one, so maybe trying to not get the demons to come back for Martin Jones against the Rangers, and we'll see if they can put up a better performance than they did then. Class dismissed.